Hey folks, thanks for coming to my channel. So, a subject that I've always had an interest in is esoterics, or the study of urban demographics. I'm currently conducting actually a study on world cities, and this is the fourth or fifth such study I have done in my life. I do them every roughly 5 years, but it's not so precise. The last one I done was 2015. This is purely personal interest. I just find the subject very interesting, seeing how cities grow, seeing how demographics shift in terms of that growth. Um, I don't know why, I just find the subject very interesting. So, this is a very comprehensive study. I literally go through the world, region by region, continent by continent, looking at every city of more than 1 million people. In the case of the UK, I'll do it more comprehensively because it's my country. Um, but I'll work out the growth rates, the growth decline, what is the city limits, what is part of the agglomeration. Anyway, a lot of that terminology is, I guess, in depth. I might make a video specifically about that subject actually, just because I find it interesting. This video is obviously related. Like I say, the study is not It's it's formal in the sense I'm taking it seriously and I'm putting a lot of work into it, but not formal in the sense I'm doing it basically for a hobby. I'm not being paid for it. I'm not publishing it or anything like that. Maybe I will one day. By the way, if you see some smoke, that's incense, just in case that comes through in the video. Um, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges in the world's megacities. Now, first of all, this term megacity doesn't have a clear definition. For example, in Bangladesh, the term megacity is any settlement of 5 million or more people, which at the moment is Dhaka and Chittagong, Chattogram as the city is also known. But more broadly speaking, in a universal sense, a megacity is generally defined as a city and its immediate agglomeration of 10 million or more people. And in some cases, for example, London, Baghdad, the city itself will be smaller, but the agglomeration will exceed 10 million. Paris is another example. So, for the working purpose of this video, when I'm talking about megacity, I'm talking about very large cities, 10 million or more. So, in that sense, somewhere like Berlin or Philadelphia would not be included because they're big cities, but they're not huge cities. So, strictly speaking, for this study, it's 10 million or more. Um, I came across a documentary. It's very interesting, but it was also quite an eye-opener to the challenges that people face. It's simply entitled Free Documentary. That's a channel, and it was about a busy road junction in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, and by far its largest city. Um, Dhaka is a good example of a mega city because it's in some ways it's not quite a primate city. What I mean by that is in some countries you get a city that is so much bigger than any other city. Um, an example of this would be Bangkok in Thailand. Bangkok is a mega city. It's enormous. Yet Thailand's second city, Chiang Mai, is a lot smaller. It's a lot more slow pace of life. The UK, on some level, we could say London is a primate city because London's about 9 million people. Our second city, Birmingham, is just over 1 million. So there's a huge gap between the first city and the second city. This is not the case in a country like Germany, where the largest city, Berlin, about 3.6 million people. Second city, Hamburg, is approaching 2 million. So the gap isn't that big. Um, Anyway, that's what that means. But in the case of Dhaka, Dhaka is growing at an enormous rate, and after Metro Manila in the Philippines, it's the world's densest populated megacity. So that means that there are more people per square kilometer than in that's how that's defined, rather than the overall population. So you get cities that might seem to have a big population, but they also cover a very big area. Incidentally, I don't want to come across as patronizing here. I might be saying things that people already know, but just for context and just for yeah, for the benefit of people who might not know. So this documentary was focused on this intersection in Dhaka, and I think it was a good example of the sort of challenges that people face in these ever-growing cities. One problem is, if we take Bangladesh as an example, it's still a developing country. It's still not a particularly wealthy country. I think it would be classed on a sort of middle income or lower middle income level, um, per capita GDP. So when you have a city like Dhaka growing as fast as it is, I mean, we're talking about several 100,000 people being added to the city's population every single year. A city that's growing at that rate in a developing country poses enormous challenges because when you have cities in developed countries, they tend to, even though, for example, London grew at a very fast pace in the 19th century, you had an infrastructure that kind of matched that. So, for example, London Underground was built in conjunction with the growth of the city. The sewage system was built in conjunction with the growth of the city. Well, actually, as a response to the Great Stink of 1858, which was a major pollution crisis in London. Um, there were certainly challenges in Victorian London and right up to the 20th century. In fact, the Great Smog of London, and I might come back to this, is often used as a template for cities today that are experiencing major pollution. That was a major disaster. About 12,000 Londoners died in December 1952 from that smog. But anyway, um, in a case like Dhaka, where you already have a limited economy, ideally there would be, for example, a subway system put in place. But because it's growing at an ever fast pace, you can't just stop a city that size in order to build, for example, a subway system. So it's a major challenge. Um, but anyway, in the documentary, I really recommend it. I'll put a link in this video. It's about 50 minutes long. Um, it showed the case of one young guy, 32. He was a bus driver, and basically he had sacrificed his own education, his own university opportunities, and so on, in order to support his rural family, so that his younger brother could go to college because his parents couldn't afford for both of them to do so. So this young guy was basically spending very long hours, like up to 16 hours, on this very busy bus route, um, and notoriously chaotic traffic. And he said basically, you would have a situation if there's an accident and someone is killed, then they can't stop because if they did, they would likely be lynched by an angry mob. This is how chaotic it is. And there was a British businessman who's lived in Dhaka for some time, said he never ever drives anywhere. He has a driving license, but he never drives because it's simply too dangerous. The risk from being knocked down, but also the risk of, frankly, mob violence. In the UK, if you were to have a hit and run incident, then people would shun that. They'd say it was selfish of the driver and they would be arrested. But in a city as densely populated as Dhaka, there's no time to sort of say, well, what happened here? It's just like, it's chaos. And I think Dhaka residents wouldn't be offended by me saying that because that's the reality of life in such a megacity. So when you look at the challenges people face in these places, it it does put things into context. If you live in a country like the UK, okay, maybe London is a different story because it's a mega city, but I would suggest like living in London doesn't have the same challenges as living in Dhaka. Because although London's a huge city, it's a planned city and it has been. It's always been planned. It's always been. I don't want to say ordered, but it's a city that's 2,000 years old, over 2,000 years old. The American cities are planned. What's happening in developing countries is the megacities are growing at such an enormous rate that there's no real planning. They're just growing and growing with so many people. Um, so that's an example of the traffic problem in a megacity. But looking at other examples, if we look at Delhi, sometimes incorrectly called New Delhi. To be specific about that, New Delhi is a much smaller city, probably around 300,000 people, so really just about the size of Sunderland. Um, within within the much bigger city of Delhi. So that can be a bit confusing. Sometimes people talk about New Delhi referring to the whole agglomeration. New Delhi is where the Indian capital is, and the whole region's national capital territory of India. Um, but Delhi, it's enormous. 24 million people within just the agglomeration, then over 40 million in the area around. And there's major cities like Noida, um, I think it's called Gurugram now. Some Indian cities have changed their names. Faridabad. These are major satellite cities around Delhi, and they're all part of that agglomeration. So collectively, 24 million people. It's enormous. Um, and I'd say it's surpassed Mumbai now as India's biggest city. Um, but the situation in Delhi is pollution. So India now lags behind China when it comes to air quality, because actually, for a while, Chinese cities were notorious for pollution. Beijing, for example, would have red days, and whilst it's still a serious problem because you have coal mining in the north of the country, it does appear that there's been some improvement in Chinese cities. Actually, some of the most polluted cities in the world appear to be in Iran. The city of Afaz in the south of Iran is very notorious for pollution, whether that's factories or loose regulations or what. India, a big problem in India, particularly in the north, is that a very large proportion of India is still rural, and people have open fires. Um, so this causes a haze, which then kind of concentrates on the capital. Added to that, you have traffic, you have factories, so it's a very serious problem. Um, in fact, air pollution is one of the biggest killers on Earth of any kind. Um, it's thought, I read somewhere about 7 million people a year die from diseases related to air pollution. That's a staggering figure. That's more than coronavirus. It's a truly staggering figure, and it might be one of the biggest causes of death in the world, actually. If we think worldwide around 50 million people die a year of all causes, if that 7 million figure is accurate, that is a staggering proportion. Really is. So I think that's one of the most pressing issues facing megacities is pollution. But like I say, this is something that London faced in the 1950s, and that was a severe problem. London still has quite serious air pollution, although it's improved. Um, so, this is something that needs to be taken seriously in megacities. The use of maybe more green sites, the use of perhaps planting more trees, but that alone won't be the answer. So it's a major, major challenge. Um, and that's not just in India. Mexico City has serious pollution, and probably every megacity does on some level, but there's variations. Um, Thinking of other examples, Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In the middle of the 20th century, that was a relatively small city. Now it's just growing at such a pace, it's about 14 million people. And it vies with Lagos for Africa's biggest city. Well, Cairo can also claim that title, depends how it's defined. Cairo, to give an example, you have Giza, which is sometimes classed as a separate city, but many would say it's just a very large suburb. Giza alone has about 4 million people. And then in the Cairo agglomeration, we're talking around 18 million. So, in that sense, it's Africa's biggest city. But part of the problem is there isn't even accurate censuses. So in the case of Lagos, you'll get probably a dozen different figures for what the population of Lagos is. Most of them tend to be around the 15 million mark. Some will say it's as high as 20 million. Some will give a lower figure of 13 million. Probably 15 million is about right. Again, Lagos was a small city in the middle of the 20th century when Nigeria got independence from Britain. Lagos, I believe, was about 300,000 people. It's now at least 15 million. So that gives an idea of just how much that has shot up. Um, London in the 19th century went from about 1 million around the turn of the century to 5 million at the end of the century. So it was growing at a very fast rate. And I believe at one point London was the largest city in the world. Then it was surpassed by New York City, which was then surpassed by Tokyo, and Tokyo for much of the 20th century. Largest city in the world today, that's a matter of debate. In terms of the metropolitan area, like the agglomeration that is Tokyo and the Tokyo Bay Area, in terms of city proper, that is a city within its limits. That might be Shanghai, it might be Jakarta, Sao Paulo. They're all huge cities and they also have large metropolitan areas. Tokyo's a huge city by any measure, but the actual, I believe it's called 12 Special Wards of Tokyo proper, is a good bit smaller. It's about 8, 9 million. It's just that the metropolitan area around Tokyo is so built up. We're talking about 37 million people. In the south of China, there's a cluster of major cities very close together. Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hong Kong. Um, so that area, that agglomeration, is known as the Pearl River Delta. And there has been some speculation that the Chinese government might decide to make that a megacity. And if that was to be made a single megacity, well, Foshan is another major center. It's the birthplace of Kung Fu. Um, Guangzhou, Foshan, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, they're all huge cities in their own right, especially Guangzhou. So if they were all kind of interlinked as one city, we'd be talking 60 million people. 60 million people. That's more than most of the world's countries. So this is what's happening in the world. Megacities are just ever growing. There's environmental challenges. There are traffic challenges. But the paradox here is often in developing countries, the only choice is to go to the megacity. So for rural Filipinos, it would be to go to Metro Manila. For rural Bangladeshis, it would be to go to Dhaka, and so on. Um, so that's what's happening. But it just, put things in context. If, like me, you live in a small city in a developed country, that's it might not be the most exciting place, but it is an advantage. People sometimes look down on Sunderland, but we don't have major air pollution, we don't have major crime. Um, so really, when you put things in context, it really, the challenges that some people have in this world, and I don't want to sound preachy here, but really looking at the challenges some people face, the sort of long hours they put in, the dangers they face, it's humbling. And it really, to me, is just a reminder that we shouldn't take things for granted. Um, and I hope that doesn't sound patronizing. It's just something that you observe when you watch these things. I mentioned crime. Again, this is something that fluctuates. For example, Karachi, Pakistan, another megacity, was notorious for crime a few years ago, but thanks to the work of the Pakistani Rangers and big efforts in that city, it's become a lot safer. Um, Also, another interesting thing you see in megacities is architecture and the changing architecture. So often in the Asian cities, you have colonial architecture from the British, from the French, from the Spanish, the Portuguese, and that's often maintained because they're listed buildings. Um, but then you get like growing upward. That seems to be a trend in many of the world's megacities. Bangalore, India, or Bengaluru, as it's now called, is has been called the Silicon Valley of India, and it looks, it looks pretty clean. It looks a kind of a good model megacity in a sense. It's relatively clean. It doesn't have the same air pollution as Delhi, and it's growing upwards. And it looks, I don't want to say wealthy, but it looks quite, you know, I'm only going by the promotional videos, and of course that isn't always the reality. But Bangalore is kind of a good role model for India in a sense. Um, then you get planned megacities, Shenzhen in southern China. I've got a map from 1998 in Atlas. It's not even on it. It's not even on the map. Now it's, depending on the definition, the fourth or fifth biggest city in China, about 11 million people. So, yeah, I mean, it's just a fascinating subject, I think. Um, I'll be talking more about this subject, but check out the documentary if you have time. It's focusing on Dhaka. What's happening in Dhaka could probably be applied in Sao Paulo or in Karachi or in Jakarta or in Metro Manila or Cairo or Moscow or any other mega city to some extent. Okay, thanks for watching. and do watch that video.